In this presentation, we will talk about your learning, how it works, and how you can improve your strategies to be a more effective learner. What you want to consider up front is that learning is a process. It's not a one-way street. You do need to put some time and effort into it, but that means that you need to be actively engaged in not only your reading, but in your classes, whether you're watching presentations or in a lecture or in different kinds of group activities, demonstrations, etc. Each one of those is an opportunity for you to see and understand and recognize information in different ways. You want to be an active learner. You want to really become one with the content or the lesson. So that means you need to ask a lot of questions. That means you need to understand about time management. You need to understand content and all of the different pieces and parts that relate to that content, your assignments, how those assignments relate to what you talked about in class and your textbook and your presentations. So an active learner is someone who doesn't just let all that information splash over them. They actually get involved and participate with it. The three principles of deep and lasting learning really relate to how you're going to make the most out of the information that you do get exposed to. One is prior learning, and that's when you take the information that you might have been exposed to in the past and you apply it to current information. It helps you use what you're learning now to help you understand what you were exposed to in the past. So it makes those connections. It helps you look at information in new and different ways. It might be a more complex way or a more sophisticated way or in a whole new way altogether. The quality of processing is when you are using deep processing in all of the strategies that you employ when you're studying. In the example I provide here, you can see there's a number you may be familiar with, like using mnemonics or mind maps or charts or rehearsal. There's a number of different things that will help you get a more deep and rich understanding of information. So just studying and repeating things over and over might be a technique you use for the moment, but not for the long term. So the better that you process that information up front, the better you're going to retrieve it later. There's a computer term called GIGO, garbage in, garbage out, and that really applies when you're talking about processing information. The other thing you want to consider is the quantity of processing. And that's when you are looking at your task and trying to assess how you're going to distribute that learning over a time period, not in a marathon session. So you want to learn and practice and review in a distributed time frame. That means you want to take things in small chunks and work with them on a pretty regular basis, not procrastinating and waiting until the last minute. So, for example, you want to read the directions. You want to read them for detail. You want to have a good depth of understanding of the expectations and everything it involves. You want to estimate how much time that task is going to take. How long will it take you to read your anatomy and physiology, 60 pages, chock full of details that you need to know for the test tomorrow? Would you read that differently than reading the first 2 chapters of your Managing Your Success textbook? Break it up into small pieces and chunk it so that you'll be able to read a few pages, assess whether you really understand it or not, and move forward. You may want to work on some homework, but not necessarily do all 20 math problems at once. Maybe do 5 and then go back after a little bit of time and do a few more problems. Then you can re-look at the ones you did previously to see if you notice any errors. You really want to engage in the material that you work with, whether it's a presentation, your assignment, your reading, whatever it might be. You really want to make sure that you are participating. And participating doesn't necessarily mean a hands-on action. It could be you're taking notes. It could be that you're reworking tools that you have, like rewriting notes into flashcards or concept maps. Then finally, you want to make sure that you always are reviewing. Make time regularly for that review. So even though you might have done all of these other steps, you still want to have about 10 minutes every day for every class that you've either just looked over your notes, reviewed information in your chapter, whatever it might be, to just keep it fresh. Your mind works a lot like a computer. The sensory input comes in from a keyboard. Your processing is your CPU or the C drive on your computer, and that's your short-term memory. And your long-term memory is your storage device. So whether that's a flash drive or external hard drive or cloud, your brain works the exact same way. Information comes in, it gets processed, and it gets stored for later use. A really simple explanation is that people learn by paying attention, and when they pay attention, it gets encoded. That encoded information gets stored, and when necessary, that information that is stored gets retrieved. But it's really not quite that simple. It's a little bit more involved. You get all of this sensory input that goes into your sensory memory, and that's everything from your lectures, your reading, presentation, notes, all the things you do in class as well. If you're really not paying attention and focused, it's going to decay. But if you do, you start getting pattern recognition, and that's where that prior learning comes into play. You start noticing, hey, I'm familiar with this, I've seen this before. So what are some of the best ways to pay attention? Well, taking notes and asking questions. Taking notes forces you to have to take that information and make meaning of it, and asking questions also helps you to participate and become a part of the conversation and the material. If information successfully leaves sensory memory, it goes to short-term memory. If it doesn't get processed in short-term memory, it gets lost, it gets displaced, and it decays. But if it is getting processed, especially when you're using a elaborative rehearsal, you will most likely ensure that that information will be remembered and get stored into long-term memory. Elaborative rehearsal is when you use techniques like changing words to your own to define concepts, creating your own examples or study questions, trying to make personal relations to the information, or transposing your notes into things like charts and concept maps. If you've successfully used elaborative rehearsal, that information is going to get encoded, and it's going to make it easier to retrieve from your long-term memory because it was filed well. So if it wasn't filed well, you're going to get a lot of interference, you're going to get a lot of lost cues, and you're not going to be able to access that information. But if it was well stored, you will be able to retrieve it when you need it. So again, the best ways to study and do homework is to break your tasks and work into chunks and do some work and review every single day. In your book, it talks about the core method, and basically that's how you process information. Again, you collect it like taking notes, going to class, watching presentations. You organize it by taking notes and making sense of those notes by creating things like flashcards or charts or concept maps. You rehearse it, so that means you take that time a little bit every day and chunk it into tasks and review, and you evaluate your understanding. You look at that quality of learning and determine where you have weak spots, and you assess yourself, and you also get feedback. You want to make sure that throughout any of the processes we talk about this semester, that you're constantly assessing your strengths and weaknesses. And you need to accept that some things will always be a weakness for you, but you can still improve. You want to understand the internal and external influences that affect you and why some things are strengths and weaknesses. And when you do that, you'll be able to make better decisions. You also want to understand why something is a strength or a weakness. Is it something internal, you have a skill or a talent, or is it something that you have made use of, like a resource or a tool? Again, even though you might have a weaker skill or talent, you can use resources and tools to build them. We will be talking later in the semester about learning styles and preferences, so think about this as we talk about different topics over the next couple of weeks. If you need more help with study skills, you can always visit the Managing Your Success YouTube channel, where we have a number of resources. You can visit the library info guide for Managing Your Success, again with a number of resources. Or you can visit the Academic Support Center website that has a number of helpful handouts and links from reliable sites and other colleges. Finally, make sure that you're making use of your resources. Whenever you do have a question or concern, ask yourself, who can I ask for help? You don't want to struggle in silence, and you don't want to leave that question unasked when it very simply can be resolved by giving you a good tool, a good resource, or answering a simple question.